So thanks everyone for coming to this panel. Today's topic is on nuclear energy and oceans and rivers. But I just wanted to, open the panel by talking about why this issue is so important, not only actually from a technical or engineering perspective, but in some ways more important from also a public perception and advocacy perception as well. As we all know here at COP, we're moving into a warming planet. And one of the things that's going to be happening is in many areas, it'll be a drier planet as well. But also the river water temperature and ocean water temperatures will also rise. And nuclear power plants, at least classically, use a lot of circulating water to help cool them down, especially, on the condenser side of things. So I want to sort of open this forum up with a very basic question. Nuclear energy is both vital for decarbonization and also vital for many areas, like here in the United Arab Emirates, to actually solve water scarcity itself. Yet many people in their perception of nuclear energy view nuclear energy as a big consumer of water. So I want us to just sort of talk about that sort of dialectic that we're having, both nuclear energy as a solution to water scarcity in a warming planet, but also the perception that nuclear energy itself might suffer from those very same phenomena. So I'm going to start with Simon. If you could just introduce yourself, what your background is, and sort of maybe 3 sentences about this issue, and then we'll go right down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Wachter. I come from Sweden, and my background is in nuclear engineering. I worked for a number of years in safety and licensing, and came into contact with nuclear and water in many ways. I wrote my thesis about nuclear power and desalination. Then I worked on new nuclear power plant siting, and of course, then you get into contact with lots of the environmental issues and the cooling options that you have. So yeah, looking forward to the panel.
Simone, given your background in both in Sweden and in nuclear licensing and safety licensing, one of the things that's so interesting is back in that heat wave back last year in Europe in 2022, there's news article after news article about the impact that the high river water temperatures was having on the inland nuclear power plants, particularly obviously in France, even though the overall production was only reduced by less than 0.2% of what the expected number of terawatt hours that we're going to generate in France. And what was ironic is here's a heat wave caused by global warming. Here's one of the cleanest grids in the world that's powered by nuclear energy. And yet there was more coverage on that than the much more polluting German grid. How do you see it from a regulatory perspective? How we're going to deal with as river water temperatures maybe are going higher than the circulating water systems were designed for? And how do you see how the public perception can really be changed on that issue?
Yeah, so we had quite a significant debate in the 2018 heat wave in Sweden. And to start with, the cooling of the nuclear power plant is fundamentally an economical optimization problem. The size of the condenser and your cooling solution depends on how much you want to spend. And also is a slight historical heritage from when we designed the plant. Our nuclear power plants were designed without computers, with slide rulers and manual computing. And we implemented a lot of conservatives. So what we did was they set a 27-degree Celsius water temperature limit for this plant, Ringhals on the west coast. And what they did to solve this problem was simply redo the calculations, and they found that they have a lot more margin than expected, because when they were doing manual calculations without the ability to simulate and so on, they just were slightly over conservative. And then when they reran the simulations, they found that they had more margin than expected. So it was actually fine to continue running the plant. Of course, any thermal power plant loses a little bit of efficiency with increasing seawater temperature, like your ultimate heat sink. But this is true for all energy sources. When the temperature is higher, the density of the air is lower. So in the winter, the wind power actually produces more energy because the air is much denser. And the same goes for solar. When the temperature goes up, you start losing some efficiency in the electronics. Yeah, so I thought maybe we should go through the different cooling solutions, but I wanted to reiterate something that both you and Dinara mentioned, that fundamentally water use is kind of a stupid term, because it involves both water withdrawals, like actually you take water and you do something with it, and water consumption, where that water is gone. And there's a very big difference between whether water is consumed or whether it's just used to be recirculated back. So just wanted to reiterate that. Then maybe we can mention that, so there are 3 basic technologies to cool a nuclear power plant. You can have a natural draft cooling tower. So you have a very tall cooling tower that creates a draft from the heat of the steam rising. Then you can have, well, I guess 4 actually. Then you can have mechanically ventilated wet cooling towers. Then they will be a lot lower, which we use in a lot of locations. I think Palo Verde uses those.
Yeah.
And yeah, we also have them here in Europe, in France and in Germany. And then you can have dry cooling towers that are drive vented. So you basically big fans to power them. Of course, there's a trade-off with the power to power those fans. And then the fourth one is where you don't have any cooling towers. And actually, no nuclear power plant in Sweden has any cooling towers. They're just on the coast, and we recirculate seawater back in. And when we built the first nuclear power plant in Forsmark, north of Stockholm in Sweden, we built this biotest lake to study the effects of nature from the heated cooling water. So this is a man-made lake in the ocean from the rock that excavated to build the nuclear power plants, so that you could keep the effect of the heated water contained and then study the effects on aquatic life in general. And what they found is kind of expected. Plants and animals that like slightly warmer water, they do really well, and plants and animals that don't like warmer water, well, they go somewhere else. So that's kind of what you see. But then you also see a big increase actually in bald eagles there, because there are much more fish outside of the nuclear power plant than anywhere else. So seabirds that depend on eating fish really thrive there. So there's a huge population of bald eagles next to the nuclear power plant.
I think this brings up a really important question, which is something that you hit on before, which is the difference between consumptive water utilization and just water utilization, right? When we're talking about those open condenser systems, right, where we don't have a cooling tower, just pumping water, say, from the ocean, like what we have at Baraka or at the Swedish nuclear power plants or many nuclear power plants around the world, right? We're running the water through the condenser and it comes out just a little bit warmer and we dump that back in. As you noted, when we have a cooling tower, however, we actually take a lot less water in from the body of water that the plant is next to, yet we do ultimately consume more. We evaporate more. It leaves the plant and then we have a little bit left that we dump back as blowdown. And yet I think we're in an interesting place right now where historically we have thought about cooling towers as actually an environmental mitigation measure to reduce the so-called thermal pollution that might impact an ecosystem at a circulating, of the river or the ocean. And yet we're now in a place where we're seeing a lot of water scarcity, especially a freshwater scarcity. How do you think that sort of new dynamic where we're sort of no longer constrained maybe by as much by ecological concerns, but instead by maybe water consumption concerns, should we really be looking back at the regulations that were placed in many countries that basically prohibit the use of an open cycle system in a river or in a lake or a freshwater system, given that consumption issue?
Yeah, maybe we should also say first that so the Swedish heating problem, for example, that was a problem of the intake water being
Right.
too warm for the regulation.
Right.
It's not really a technical issue, and you can upsize the condenser, etc. The issue with the heating that we saw in the French nuclear power plant was environmental regulatory issue with water that was being emitted back after being heated by the nuclear power plant, because then you would go over the threshold for how much you're allowed to heat the water there. And of course, that was also a problem because this is also fresh water in the rivers and it affects the life in these rivers. And when you're talking about the access to water that we have today, a lot of the water, pretty much all of it that we consume, comes from aquifers. And we consume the water in these aquifers in different ways. We use a lot of it for agriculture. And when we water, most of it evaporates and goes away into the atmosphere. And it takes very long time for these aquifers to replenish. We also use up the water in aquifers in other way by pollutants. So for example, when we do fracking or other activities underground, we can pollute these ecosystems and water resources. And this is a very significant and growing problem. But it is absolutely very solvable because we do know how to desalinate water. Of course, here in UAE, kind of the champion of desalination, we have just a few kilometers away from here, one of the biggest desalination plants in the world, if not the biggest. And it's actually quite cheap. There's been a lot of worries about would countries go to war over water resources? But it turns out you could build a desalination plant for the cost of 1 week to go to war. So it doesn't really make sense because it's actually very, very cheap to make water. And I think this is also a solution, of course, where nuclear could contribute greatly because you have a lot of cheap and fossil-free energy. Then you can use that energy to produce more desalinated water. This is one of my favorite topics, so I'm going to take the opportunity to hijack it a little bit. I spent a lot of time working on nuclear beyond electricity, and of course, there's great opportunities to use the heat because what you fundamentally produce is heat. Then you choose to make electricity from that heat, but you can do other things as well. And where I live in Stockholm, we did have one of the OG small modular reactors that was built for the model suburb that was supposed to have housing, jobs, schools, etc. And this was all heated and powered by this small reactor that produced both the heat and the power for this suburb. And globally, 50% of all the energy we use is heat. And this is responsible for 40% of our total carbon emissions. 50%, half of that heat again, so around 25% of our total energy use is for heating buildings and hot water and for cooking. And this is heat at low temperatures, around 100, 120 degrees, that we can most definitely supply today. And around 70 nuclear power plants globally do also supply heat as well. And I know, for example, in Switzerland, all their nuclear reactors also supply heat for different kinds of district heating purposes, from greenhouses to cardboard factories. So it's doable today.
Yeah. This discussion is really about, the impact that we have on oceans and rivers. And, most of that impact, actually, generally for a nuclear power plant, the largest interface that the plant has with the environment is through that cooling system through the oceans and rivers. But it's important, I think, we distinguish between waste heat or so-called waste heat and process heat or, energetic heat. And the basic problem is, from basic physics, you can't ever extract 100% of the work out of a heat source that you're generating. So you have the heat coming out of the reactor. You just can't, by the second law of thermodynamics, get all of that and convert it into useful work. So we have to have some of it left over as waste heat. And I think, the question that we have here is things that are traditionally thought of as waste heat, which is what we generally have in that circulating water in the condenser. Is there going to be applications now for, say, district heating, especially with larger, say, industrial heat pumps, that we can boost that up from 40 degrees Celsius, maybe up to 100 degrees Celsius with not that much energy input? What are we thinking about, given where we are, the reevaluation of the classical sort of dichotomy between waste and process heat, or waste and work heat?
Yeah, of course, we can use it exactly like you say. A nuclear reactor is maybe 3 gigawatt thermal, and we decide to make about 1 gigawatt of that into electricity. Those remaining 2 gigawatts of 10-degree warmer water than seawater really is very difficult to find a good use for. You could maybe use it to heat some kind of greenhouse a little bit, but it has limited applications. I think they do this at one of the reactors in Switzerland, for example. But what you can do is you can run the steam through a reactor for the high pressure turbine, and then at a number of points extract steam very efficiently to not only get like a 1-to-3 relationship between the electricity and the heat, but for every kilowatt hour that you lose in electricity production, you can get somewhere around 7 to 8 kilowatt hours of heat out if you optimize this process. And this is, of course, a very big potential for nuclear power plants. The kind of issue, of course, is that the nuclear power plants produce so much heat that it's difficult to find a good off-taker for them. It's only cities with several million people that have that high enough a demand for heating. And even then in the summer, it's usually a factor 10 lower.
I saw a question over there, please.
I'm from Egypt, which is a developing country. And my question is, the climate change issues and solutions are costly. When we talk about desalination of seawater, it's nice to tackle these ideas, but actually in the countries where most of the problems lie, funds and money are very scarce. So I would like to discuss what's your point of view, and getting funds for such projects is not easy. It's very challenging. People's awareness are still not within the average even knowledge of the issue. So what's your opinion about these challenges in the developing countries?
Even with the cost reductions in renewables that we have seen now, the major barrier to getting renewables deployed in the developing world is financing, because the cost of capital in developing countries is extremely high. And of course, we need to find mechanisms to lower that cost of capital.
All right. If you want to talk a little bit more, is there anything that we've missed?
My poor joke aside, I do have some little closing remarks. Kind of want to return to something Dinara mentioned in the beginning, that everything has an environmental impact. And I mean, this panel is not about diminishing the environmental impact, that you do get some kind of effects from the slight warming of water that you emit. But we also have to accept that. So today I read a new article. It was Swedish research from the Swedish Meteorological and Hydrological Institute showing that offshore wind farms have an impact on the way water currents mix, because they disturb the flow of the wind, which changes how the water mixes downwind from the wind farm, and it changes the salinity and the nutrients in the water. Of course, this is not a major effect on ecosystems. And when we oppose clean solutions like renewables and nuclear, because they are not perfect, then we implicitly accept a system where we have very major effects from the fossil fuel system that we already have today, with the fracking or oil tanker accidents. So yeah, let's keep our eyes on the target here.
The famous zero risk bias. But thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for our amazing panelists, and thank you for attending.